For many English people, their relationship with Premier League football borders on something of an obsession. When it comes to club ownership, your average fan, bombarded as they are by 24/7 rolling sports news, fan forums and endless coverage, would probably be able to tell you at the very least who owns their club. But not many, you would think, would be able to tell you how their club is owned. Complex ownership structures, opaque holding arrangements, secretive jurisdictions, in our now global game, all are becoming increasingly common in the way clubs are financially managed and controlled. And many bear the high-risk hallmarks we're trained to spot and investigate as financial crime specialists. So, should we be worried? We're bringing you a special episode of Registries Revealed today, featuring Nicholas Lord and Peter Duncan, two researchers from the University of Manchester's Department of Criminology. Nick and Pete are responsible for a recent research paper which dives headfirst into the world of football ownership, analysing how clubs are structured and exposing how these structures could be used for illicit financial flows. Their research touches on many of the themes we've been discussing in this series, including beneficial ownership transparency, the role of regulators, and limitations with corporate registries. So let's take a detour from our regular schedule, put on both our detective hats and our replica shirts, and listen to how two determined fans are using their financial crime investigative powers to shine a light on some pretty big risks. Nick, Pete, welcome to the show. Great to have you both here. I can think of a number of people I know who would probably love to spend a few months researching and writing about Premier League football. Probably not many, though, which used to focus on corporate structures and illicit finance. So, Nick, tell us a bit more about the project to start with and what inspired you to investigate this topic, first of all.
So, in terms of my own career, I've been researching illicit finance, money laundering, financial crime now for quite a bit of time, 10 plus years. And I guess the motivation for this particular project came about on the back of an invitation I received to review a book in the Netherlands by a colleague, Hans Nederland. So he's a professor of criminology at Maastricht University. And he wrote a book called Outrageous, which was all about essentially a combination of an ostrich and outrageous. So this book, Outrageous. And in the book, he analysed various forms of financial crime that he considered to be undermining the integrity of football clubs and the football system more generally. And on the back of reviewing that book for Hans, he then decided to put together a special issue in a journal where he invited authors from across Europe to contribute papers on issues relating to financial crime and football or sports more generally. And then as an avid football fan like Pete, we decided, well, what can we do in that case that might be interesting for us in terms of looking at the Premier League? And as I mentioned, quite a bit of my research to date has looked at how corporate vehicles can be misused as part of criminal enterprise. That is, how do criminal actors go about concealing, converting, controlling their illicit finance or their proceeds of crime, making use of legal entities like limited companies, trusts, and so on. So we thought we'd put together that expertise to think through the ways in which some of these warning signs that we see with other money laundering cases might be in existence in the Premier League ownership structures.
And Pete, was this something you'd both been thinking about for a while, or was it a completely new exercise embarking on this topic?
Yeah, so undertaking this research, we actually put together pretty quickly. As Nick said, we're both fans of football, both interested in financial crime research and illicit finance. And I had just completed my PhD last year in looking at illicit tax minimisation in professional football, so the ways in which football clubs and football players can cut their taxes in ways that might be legally or morally dubious. But that wasn't really what I was planning to focus on when I first applied to do my PhD. Originally, Nick, who was my supervisor, and I really wanted to look much more broadly at the picture of illicit finance in football. But we quickly realised that was going to be too broad for a PhD, so I had to focus it down. But then after completing that PhD and still wanting to focus on these other issues related to illicit finance in football, we realised this would be a really good opportunity to be able to do that.
Well, it's an absolutely fascinating topic because it's something that, on the one hand, gets so much press. I mean, we all know about football ownership to one extent or another as football fans. But certainly, I haven't, I'm sure many haven't taken the time to actually look behind and think, who owns these companies and what's the type of vehicles they use to do that. So, Nick, just talk us through, you mentioned a couple there, but what are the typical types of legal entities and arrangements that tend to be used in club ownership?
So it varies quite a bit by jurisdiction, in that different types of vehicle or legal entity can be created in different jurisdictions, and often they'll have different features or characteristics that are beneficial for that particular jurisdiction. But generally, we see things like limited companies, limited liability companies, limited partnerships, trusts, and various other forms of legal entity. I think in the case of the Premier League, limited partnerships and limited companies were the most prevalent form of structure that we saw, but also the use of trusts as well, which of course altogether combine to obscure at times who the underlying beneficial owners are, or the people who invest the funds in football clubs.
Yeah, we should probably say at the start, I guess, that to be clear, your research didn't expose any specific kind of illicit financing, but what we're talking about is the type of arrangements and what they might be able to facilitate. Let's just start with the other side of that, though. So what are maybe some of the legitimate reasons that clubs might use a limited partnership or a trust in their ownership structure?
So there can be very good reasons to make use of different companies, different firms, entity structures as part of the ownership in order to share or control or move around the shares attached to different individuals who might be investing in the club. They can be used to organise different activities, commercial activities that are associated to the club as well. So often we see that clubs have different kinds of resource income and different activities. So you can organise those activities using different structures, if you like. But yeah, as you mentioned at the start, in essence, what we're saying with the research is not that there is illicit activity taking place within the Premier League or in the ownership structures, but that we see some features or some warning signs that are common elsewhere with, say, money laundering cases, where these same mechanisms can be used for illicit purposes to obscure the individuals involved and the source of finance as well.
Point, Nick, we should come on to is what are some of the risk factors that are associated then with these structures, maybe coming to the other side of the equation then. Lots of our listeners will be working in financial crime and very familiar with the types of nefarious structure or behaviour that might go into things like money laundering or fraud. But just talk us through what you identified and maybe observed as risk factors that are specific to the football world.
Yeah. So again, what we did with the research is started off by looking at the literature on illicit finance, money laundering, financial crime more generally. That is the academic literature, to see what we know about how corporate vehicles, entities can be misused to obscure paper trails, illicit finance, proceeds of crime, and so on. And there are certain features or warning signs that are prevalent or common with many large-scale laundromat schemes, for instance, and other forms of financial crime. So it might be, for instance, the presence of unnecessarily contrived ownership arrangements, whereby you have multiple layers of ownership across multiple jurisdictions, making use of different entity types, all where it seems to be unnecessary to have those structures in place. So that raises a question, why are these very obscure, contrived arrangements being put in place? What is the justification for that? And there might be good commercial reasons for that, in order to protect, say, the activities of a legitimate company, or hide perhaps who a wealthy benefactor might be for security reasons. But that in itself, this obscurity that is created through this multi-layered and complex arrangements that can be created, is certainly a warning sign. And then other things as well, such as the ability to obtain information or data about the beneficial owners of each of the corporations or entities as part of those structures. So, for instance, if you are unable to access information about who the underlying shareholders or owners of a particular company in a certain jurisdiction are, that raises concerns about the transparency of the organisation, especially when it comes to things like football clubs, which are important assets, important institutions for many people, not just the owners of those clubs.
Yeah, and I think people will be asking, what's an example that we can point to here of, a particularly complex structure? Not to single anyone out, but I think you brought in a particularly interesting one in your research, which was the case of Aston Villa. Just maybe tell us a little bit about that structure and what was unusual about that one.
As you mentioned at the start of this call, we didn't identify any illicit activity, and that wasn't really the objective of our research. So when we did mention the Aston Villa structure, it's in no way supposed to imply that there is any of that activity happening at Aston Villa, but they just happened to have an ownership structure at the time that displayed all of the risk factors that we were interested in looking at in football. So the actual club itself, Aston Villa, is a limited company. It's then very quickly, its ownership chain moves into a company that's incorporated in Luxembourg. And then from that point splits into two separate branches, one that goes into an LLC in the US and another that goes through a range of different corporate entities in Luxembourg, Portugal, back to Luxembourg, and then into a private trust in the Cayman Islands. So it's that use of lots of different corporate entities, many more than are strictly necessary to run a Premier League football club, but also the use of risky jurisdictions that we traditionally associate with secrecy or low tax rates, and then also having entities such as trusts that obscure the beneficial ownership of those sorts of entities.
Wow, so we've got Luxembourg, Cyprus, Delaware, probably jurisdictions that will be familiar to long-term listeners of the podcast. And have they given any justification as to why that structure exists? Are there any kind of public commentary on it?
Nothing that we found, although it wasn't part of our research process to look for justifications for those sorts of things. I think there are legitimate justifications for this, such as spreading risk. The owners of Aston Villa also have shares in other clubs operating in Europe. So some of the structures that we've seen could have been ways to ensure that they were abiding with UEFA obligations around not owning 50% or more of more than one club, for example. But we haven't looked and seen any sort of publicly stated justifications for these structures.
And I guess one of the challenges I imagine you faced, and lots of people will know all about working in financial crime, was actually unpicking these structures to start with and trying to draw the linkages between those different entities. I mean, I've worked with numerous organisations and analysts trying to do that job, and it can take hours, if not weeks, to do that. So for you, Pete, how did you approach the research? Where were you able to obtain the data, and how did you go about peeling back those layers?
So the biggest data source that we used is the Moody's database Orbis. So I'll talk about that a bit more in a second, but I'll talk about some of the smaller data sources we used as well. So one of the things that Nick said we're interested in is looking at jurisdictions that are traditionally associated with providing secrecy to people who incorporate there. So we looked at the Tax Justice Network's Financial Secrecy Index, which is available online. And that's basically a ranking of jurisdictions by how much secrecy they provide. And one of the measures that contributes to that ranking is what they call their secrecy score. So it's a measure out of 100 of how much secrecy, of how much the legislation in a jurisdiction provides for secrecy for people who incorporate there. So we just extracted that information. We also did at times use publicly available information listed by clubs. So, for example, shareholder reports for West Ham or Manchester United, and also documentation on Companies House.
If I can just add to that as well. One issue, of course, is with identifying who the human individuals are behind each of these structures. And that can be very challenging, of course. But the other issue is trying to identify the flow of funds as well, or the investment into particular vehicles. So often we see now with many club ownership arrangements, they might in part be owned by investment firms or hedge funds and so on. The issue there is that we have very little understanding of who the individuals actually are that invest in these vehicles. We're reliant very much on the owners involved in the structure to undertake sufficient due diligence and get to know their customers or their clients, if you like. But it's very challenging to fully understand where funds might be coming from when, as we've mentioned earlier, it's very straightforward to develop these very contrived arrangements, making use of multiple jurisdictions, different entity types, and so on. So, the extent to which we can, on the one hand, understand who the actual human, natural people are behind these entities is challenging, but also understanding the flow of finances through these structures as well.
I guess just on that, when it comes to changes of ownership or changes in these structures, I suppose some of our listeners who are maybe more peripherally familiar with what's been going on in the football world might be familiar with things like the fit and proper persons test. So new regulations that were introduced looking at club ownership, club directorship. Do the league look at the complexity or the transparency of an ownership structure when considering who's a fit and proper person?
Yeah, so the owners and directors test at the moment, it's obviously being reviewed at the moment with the independent football regulator hopefully coming in. But at the moment, the only people who need to take that test are people who are going to own 25% or a greater amount of shareholdings in a club, or people who are going to become a director. So that's a relatively high bar when we're thinking about investment in football. That's basically the threshold that needs to be met before anyone needs to undergo this test.
Yeah, I just add as well. So, these arbitrary thresholds are in place, if you like, 25%, it might be 15% elsewhere with the EU directives that are coming into force. Even if we reduce this down to 10% in terms of thresholds for which information has to be provided about the individuals that have some kind of stake in the club, it's very straightforward to circumvent these rule-based thresholds. So 25, 15, 10%, there are ways around that. So if you're kind of intent on obscuring or hiding who the individuals are that are involved in a particular structure or club, it's very straightforward to do that using these mechanisms that we've discussed previously.
Pete, you mentioned earlier using public sources for the data, and obviously one of the first sources that you might consider going to would be things like UBO registers. Naturally, with that limitation, as you just said, Nick, that often they're only going to be capturing 25% owners or more. Pete, were these sources you used, and if so, what challenges or limitations did you face?
So we tried to determine ultimate beneficial ownership through Orbis, and that was possible up to a point. When you got to an opaque corporate entity that doesn't then lead to natural people. Essentially our research process stopped there and we couldn't go any further. But there are other challenges, which is to some extent for some clubs, for example, I'm thinking Wolverhampton Wanderers and AFC Bournemouth here, that are owned by essentially listed companies. They have hundreds of shareholders that we felt were sort of qualitatively insignificant for mapping out the ownership structures of these clubs. So at some point we needed to decide. Again, as Nick was just saying, we're not that keen on thresholds, but at some point we did need to decide how small of a shareholding became no longer relevant for us to continue the ownership structure. And we decided on 5%. So when it shows you the ownership diagrams of all of the shareholders in, say, the listed company that is the ultimate beneficial owner of Bournemouth, we've got hundreds of clubs that I need to look through the percentage diagrams for to say that's not relevant, that's not relevant, that's not relevant. But having a systematic way to do that would have sped up the research process quite a lot.
And just to finish off then, so in your paper, you talk about some of the recommendations or options there are to improve this situation for policymakers. So I'll maybe come to you both on this question, but Nick, maybe we'll start with you. What are the key recommendations you would pull out? How can we change this situation?
Yeah, so I guess in the context of England and Wales, or the UK more broadly, the expectation is that in the near future, we might have a new independent football regulator. The Football Governance Bill is currently being discussed in the House of Lords, and this research as well was mentioned in there, which was nice to see. But I think, if that does come to fruition and this new regulator is introduced, then for me, it would be beneficial or make sense to have some kind of screening branch or arm within this football regulator, whereby they could screen or scrutinise the ownership structures, the vehicles, the entities that form the ownership of different clubs, to ensure that the beneficial owners can be identified. So to take a much more stringent and diligent approach to understanding who the individuals are within that. So I think that's one thing that could happen. I'd also like to see more ground up type responses as well. So things like mystery shopping. So I gave the example earlier of, say, investment firms and hedge funds and so on, and the extent to which some of the monies that might be invested in these vehicles is very difficult to identify whether or not it is illicit or licit. And what we might do there, therefore, is pose as clients of these investment firms, provide some information, a scenario, a hypothetical situation about where our funds is coming from, just to ensure or to test even whether or not they're carrying out sufficient diligence on who we are as individuals and what our source of wealth is. So I think there's a way that we could, dip test or mystery shop to see whether or not some of these entities are carrying out the diligence that we would expect of them.
Yeah, super interesting that there might be, improvements that could take place all over that ecosystem. So not only within government at the regulator side, but as you said, some of the commercial entities that are financing or involved in financing those clubs as well. Mm-hmm. We see all the time different sectors, even within financial services, having different levels of risk-based approach and various controls. So, yeah, to think that, clubs are part of a wider financial ecosystem as well as, getting out on the pitch. It certainly sounds like there's some work that could be done there.
Yeah. And you mentioned then, the risk-based approach, Steve. And obviously, to some extent, we have a rules-based approach currently with the owners and directors test, in that there are these thresholds in place. And if you kind of go above these thresholds, you're therefore required to provide more information about your ownership structure. But maybe rules-based approaches aren't the most efficient when it comes to scrutinizing who the individuals are behind these structures and where the wealth is coming from. So perhaps, some kind of combination of principles-based approach alongside a risk-based approach might make more sense to identify which structures or which clubs might be at more risk of or more susceptible perhaps to enabling or allowing the flow of illicit finances through those clubs. And I think another issue in terms of the principles comes around the integrity of the individuals involved. So currently there's a very high bar when it comes to determining whether or not people are fit and proper, if you like. And usually that means a requirement or evidence of, say, serious criminal conduct in the past. So that might be a conviction in another jurisdiction, but of course that is a very high bar to reach. Most people will not have convictions, yet they might be implicated in various forms of illicit activity, depending on how we define that. And of course, with many financial crimes, often we see a significant lag in terms of when these criminal behaviours take place and when they're actually detected and then dealt with by the authorities. So that could be 10, 12, 15 years. So it's important, therefore, to take more of a principles-based approach when scrutinising new owners at the start to make sure that they are people who are fit and proper.
Yeah, it's almost like you're waiting for a scandal to happen before you implement proper controls, whereas it should be the other way around, right?
Yeah.
Pete, I'll give you the final thought on that one. What else do you think policymakers or regulators could be doing on this?
So, yeah, I definitely think that closer scrutiny of these structures, especially those that seem to be unnecessarily contrived or convoluted, that needs to happen. And, going back to what Nick was saying about a principles-based approach as opposed to a rules-based approach, we're not advocating for bans on, having holding companies incorporated in the Cayman Islands, for example. We don't think that that's really the right approach. I personally think that what is better is to look much closely at the reasons or the justifications that people give for incorporating in this sort of way, creating these sorts of chains, and maybe then they'll be approved. So, for example, coming back to the Aston Villa structure that we talked about, they have two separate natural persons who are the owners. Obviously, that's going to create more complexity in the ownership chain than if they just had a single natural person owner. So I think in those sorts of cases, the sort of structure that we see with Aston Villa might be more acceptable. But yeah, it's just much more about not just letting these things happen without any oversight at all, but looking into it in more detail and seeking justification where lots of these risk factors are identified. And I also think it's important that these sorts of structures are reviewed on an ongoing basis and not just during a takeover, because otherwise it would be possible to just complete your takeover and then completely change the ownership structure of the club. I think it needs to be done on an ongoing basis to really protect clubs from becoming embroiled in any illicit finance issues.
Yeah, and maybe one final thing, sorry, Steve, to mention, you'll be aware that the European Union has introduced new rules around anti-money laundering and the extent to which football clubs will now be brought within the obliged entities definition. In other words, football clubs in the European Union from 2029 will have to have sufficient due diligence and know your customer mechanisms in place to scrutinise the people who own entities in their structures, but also the funds that flow through their organisations, and identify anything that is suspicious. So one question is whether or not the UK or England and Wales needs to come in line with that shift as well and introduce more stringent requirements in terms of AML for football clubs. I mean, whether or not that's a good idea or not is open to debate, I think.
Well, Nick, Pete, it's a fascinating piece of work. So thank you, firstly. And I'd really encourage everybody listening to give the research a proper read. So we'll put a link to that in the description. Sounds like it's already getting some good pickup and some good discussion at very high levels of policy making. So it's a long may that continue. And yeah, I want to thank you both for your time. It's been great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, thanks for having us.